So The Devil by Name is a sequel to Fever House, and it picks up 5 years after the events of that book, and essentially follows a number of the characters from Fever House while adding some new ones, and really just solves that diabolical question of what happens when the lethal remnants from the first book are still in play, and people have to navigate this wasteland of a corporate run America filled with zombies.
To kick things off, I wanted to tell you about a little boon in my life, actually. So recently, after Stephen King tweeted about some stuff, my one of my top two videos on my YouTube channel is me talking to you about Fever House. So
Oh, wow.
um,
That's
what
awesome.
that means to me is like Stephen King went and he started raving about these books, and obviously it had an impact on like the visibility of your books and like your sales, and I'm guessing even like your back catalog, because I saw you were posting one of your other books was like charting pretty well recently.
Yeah.
But it's having an effect on other people who have talked about it too. So like that's my kind of ham-handed way of congratulating you on having Steven out there talking about Fever House and The Devil by Name, and kind of acknowledging that there is a force behind that type of an endorsement that is a good thing to have. So
Yeah.
how have you been doing with all that?
I mean, it's incredible because like we for one, I think the dude just deserves accolades, because he does not squander a platform like that. Like he uses it to continually
Mm-hmm.
boost creative projects of people who aren't as well known as him. And so I think that should be like lauded. Um, but yeah, it's crazy we tried really hard. One of the things that is a change from going from an indie to a big publisher is you have these meetings with like all these marketing people, and
Yeah.
people whose job it is to solely get your book in front of people. And we tried really hard to get a book in front of Stephen King for like a long time. And for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. And then Joe Hill, his son, who's also another incredible writer,
Mm-hmm.
read it, and he was kind of talking about it. And so that was able to get the ball kind of rolling organically. And
Nice.
so it's really interesting to be like, we tried really hard for a little while to make it happen, and then it just happened naturally. And yeah, it's so cool, man.
Well, the nice thing about it is that he read it and he genuinely enjoyed the stories, and so um, I don't think that there's a better. There was a there was a conversation on Twitter or something recently about blurbs and how effective blurbs are, and Joshua Chaplinsky I was talking to recently kind of turned me around on the idea of blurbs being like you already have to know about the book to see the blurb, and then it occurred to me in this conversation online that like I think that a tweet to Stephen King's 7 million followers is probably more powerful than Stephen King's blurb on the front of your book.
Yeah, I bet there are publishers who have that mapped out numerically. Um,
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, definitely.
yeah, but like, I mean, the cool thing is that once that happened, I was, he emailed me out of the blue, and
Nice.
I was at dinner with my wife and my kids, and this email from him came in, and it was just like incredible.
Yeah.
Because he's a very human dude, and so I was able to like broach the idea of like, hey, would you be cool with blurbing these books? And I
Right.
didn't hear from him for a day or two, and I was like, oh, I fucking burned that bridge, because he must get asked for things transactionally every goddamn time like just
Right.
constantly. And so I was real trepidatious about doing that, but then he was like, yeah, I can come up with something. And it was just like this relief of like, oh my gosh, I hadn't,
Yeah.
he hadn't like sloughed me off as some jerk or whatever. Um, but yeah, it's fantastic. And it's like, it's one of those things where, Fever House has this trippy kind of like, especially with the sequel coming out, but it's still getting discovered regularly, and it still has
Yeah.
legs. which is just incredible. That's what you want for a book, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking at a copy of House of Leaves the other day, and I happened to look at the kind of like, the legal stuff at the front. And the book that I was looking at was in its like 51st printing or something.
Yeah.
That book has not lost any momentum. And
And it
like,
won't,
yeah,
I
that
don't
would
think
be
it
the
won't. I think
dream.
that's one of those like Moby Dick kind of
Yeah.
books that are like, okay, when I'm when I'm mentally prepared, I'm going to tackle this. I still haven't done it. I started it and was like, can't
Hmm.
penetrate this, dude. But I
Yeah.
want to at some point, you know?
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. There's a point you get to where it's like, oh man, this is difficult. But
Hmm.
so yeah, that's great. And I like that Stephen King takes the opportunity to just be a fan about stuff instead of
Yeah.
being like the lord of horror or anything. He's just like another dude, like you said. And so like that's I like seeing those.
Yeah, totally. It's great. And I mean, it's really cool. He's just a very human guy, you know, and like has like the same kind of sense of like does interviews and then is like, oh, I sounded like a dumbass there, that kind of thing. Like we all do, you know?
Yeah. Um, so uh, I had to kind of map out in my head as far as Fever House and then The Devil by Name, because we talked last year when Fever House came out, and I did the math. There were 37 books between reading Fever House and reading The
Oh
Devil
my
by Name.
God. That's
So
incredible, man.
so
Yeah.
my memory wasn't super fresh, and one of the things I thought was great about the layout of The Devil by Name was the person's name at the beginning of every chapter just really zeroed me into what was going on with that person.
Right.
um but yeah, another big chunky book. So Fever House, I think, is like a straight 400, and Devil by Name comes in right around the same amount there. And yeah, so it was like revisiting this, my memories of the story that I had read before. But the
Yeah.
nice thing about the setup between Fever House and jumping into The Devil by Name is that 5 years later situation where we still have some of the same characters that existed in Fever House, but 5 years of stuff had happened in between. I'm assuming that, I mean, obviously that's the story you wanted to tell, but one of the benefits of that is giving yourself some room to say, well, since you flipped that last page, I'm going to refer back to things that happened between then and now to kind of buffer out the connective tissue between the stories. And I know that was very long winded, but was that a nice kind of thing to have that 5 year gap to kind of like say, in between then and now, here's what happened?
I mean, I don't know if it was more like necessary.
Yeah.
Because when I got the call from my editor, uh, to when she like wanted to buy Fever House, she was like, "Are you willing to write a sequel?" And I had no intention of writing a sequel when I originally shopped it around for an agent.
Hmm.
Like Paul Tremblay is the master of this ambiguity in his endings, where you're not quite sure how much of things were real or like what the end result is going to be. And I'm like, I felt absolutely fine with the ending of Fever House the way it was.
Right.
But Random House wanted a sequel, and I'm like, oh well, you people are changing my life here. I will happily write a sequel, you know. But I also knew that like writing Fever House 2.0 would not work, you know, and it would be
Mm-hmm.
kind of trying to capture uh, something that had already been captured and just doing the same thing again, you know. And like honestly, I didn't
Yeah.
know if I could do it, and I didn't know how fun it would be to read. So I knew I just had to try something new. And honestly, like I don't know, man. I wrote a first draft for Devil and wrote it fast and then sent it to my editor, and she was like, "Yeah." And it's like, yeah, and then the dot dot dot, and you can always tell that shit has gone south when you know.
Right.
And so I tried to kind of make Devil a more like crime heavy things focusing around John Bonner and the Fever House in Portland
Hmm.
5 years after the fact. And it just didn't have any momentum because all the auxiliary characters um, weren't in play until the last like 20% of the book. And so there
Hmm.
wasn't a lot at risk. And I tried to make it more of just a hard boiled crime thing. And it just fell flat. So I had to rewrite the book essentially. So there's maybe 10% of Devil um, in the published book from the first draft, maybe 10%. And
Wow.
I just had to
Wow.
start over. And the challenge was that I had just kind of, you know how you're painting a floor and then you realize you painted yourself into a corner. Like there are a
Yeah.
lot of threads and puzzle boxes to figure out at the end of Fever House of like, oh, how do you carry the story forward after this? You
Right.
know? So that was the challenge.
Well, and another thing with the type of story that Devil by Name is that you kind of can't not acknowledge a global catastrophe in without going places. And
Yeah.
so, like the book starts out in France with Naomi,
Right.
and it's not all kind of like the contiguous 48 states or whatever. Like it's something that you see on a more global scale than the previous book. But I also like the fact that there's something, and this is me being naive. At some point, there's kind of like a road trip element, like of the big kind of thing that's going to happen at the end. Not everybody is already there.
Yeah, everybody's traveling.
The thing about not everybody being in the same place is that, like, in order to get them there, you know, there's traveling, and I was thinking, like, why is a road trip and like a post-apocalyptic story so kind of connected? And it occurred to me that maybe it is because when you're talking about a global event, a world changing event, you have to show the world a little bit. But I don't know if you have other thoughts on that, but like it was kind of one of those things where it's like, oh, we get some traveling, we're on the road, we're seeing, but it also gives you an opportunity to showcase what the impact of this thing is on the different people in the world. So maybe there's a part of that too.
Yeah, I had originally, like I said, the first draft was so self-contained inside the Fever House of Portland
Mm-hmm.
that when my agent was like, or my editor was like, yeah, this isn't working. I just had to get bigger, and
Yeah.
more expansive. And so that's where that came from. And I also, honestly, man, like I think that I am not, I don't have unlimited tricks up my sleeve, And I think a road trip, like I did a road trip novel in Smoke City, And like
Yeah.
I think that's one of the tools in my quiver is like, oh yeah, it's a road trip book. And
Mm-hmm.
so as start as the books start piling up, like I'm gonna have to start coming up with, taking other risks than just the road trip books.
Well, it gave us an opportunity to meet a character named Dean Haggerty, which, um, if you ask me, was one of my favorite
I love
people.
that. I love that people are into Dean because I was
Yeah.
worried that he would feel tacked on. I love the hell out of him as a character too, but I'm glad that like other people, are reacting to him so well.
Well, in the aftermath, and this could just be me reading into it or seeing what I as a reader want to see in the story, but in the aftermath of something so devastating as what happened in this book, you need someone to represent like adaptability, like the goodness of humanity or hope or things like that. And so this guy who just kind of is deciding, I'm going to keep moving forward,
Yeah,
and I'm going to take I'm going to make the best of this bad situation. Um and then, do that kind of thing, he's an anchor. He's like a grounding kind
yeah,
of
and trying to
force.
connect with people, like
Mhm.
actively trying to connect with as a way of sustaining his life and staying alive, but also like that intentionality of like my sustenance is reliant on interacting with other people, you know.
Mhm. Yeah,
which is not what the rest of the book is really touting a lot, you know?
right. Well, and it makes me think of the sequel to Bird Box. So the book Mallory, I don't know if you read it or not,
Mm-mm.
contains one of the most fascinating characters, if you ask me, in that story is, so this is like 15 years after the um, events of Bird Box, and there's a guy who's going around on foot, like door to door, but he's a census taker. So he's gathering information
Oh, I love
about
it. I love it.
what's going on in the world. And immediately my thought about that guy was, this guy is the source of information. He knows
Uh-huh.
stuff. He's got the stories. He's seen the stuff. And so you've got those characters that just kind of like become significant because of what they choose to do. And so like Dean in this book reminds me a lot of the census taker in Mallory, as just being the person who's out there, like you said, connecting and making
Yeah.
contact with people, but also seeing shit and getting involved in shit because of it.
Yeah. And there's something about that. I've got to read that because like that idea of such a like kind of stuffy um normalcy of a census taker in a post-apocalyptic world.
Yeah.
That is the type of shit that I just shoot it into my veins, man. It's so fun,
Oh yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Mallory is a great story in ways that you wouldn't really expect. But that was one of them where, and then I was talking to Josh Mallerman about it, and like we were just geeking out about like you could do an anthology of census taker stories, you know, like
Right,
little short
right.
stories of
Yeah,
like him on the road or whatever. I think you
totally.
could do the same thing with Dean. Like Dean would be like an easy, you know, while Dean was on the road going from point A to point B,
Yeah.
this thing happened. Like the guy on the chair, like that kind of thing
Right, right.
was just like something that Dean saw. So
Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
a lot of potential with that character. But you gotta love a character who doesn't walk away when he has no reason to stay too,
Mhm.
right? And that's definitely a quality of the Dean character that I like, is that um, you know, there was no personal investment in anything that was going on really, but he was along for the ride.
Yeah, and we're trying to navigate this without giving out a lot of
Yeah.
spoilers and all that. Um, but yeah, there comes a kind of crux in like Dean's decision making where he's like, "Oh, this does not actively involve me one bit."
Yep.
And yet I need to involve myself in it, you know? And that is like a I would sometimes be hard pressed to do that, you know, in
Yeah.
my life. And I think it's a testament to the character, which sounds incredibly dorky for the writer to say, but you know, um I my challenge is to not make all these people one dimensional and made out of cotton candy and boring, you know? And so I think that like ideally he had enough nuance to make that decision believable, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there was a integrity to the character throughout, that when it came to that point,
Yeah.
it was a believable choice. Yeah. I know we're being
Yeah.
pretty vague, but like, so for anybody listening, this is a character who, like, in the aftermath, in the present day, 5 years after the, you know, events of the end of Fever House, basically just is a, like a mobile, like convenience store
Yeah,
in
like
a
a
way.
garage sale kind of dude.
He just finds stuff of value, collects it, and then like on a bicycle with a trailer, just goes around, you know, trading, like bartering
Yeah.
for survival, more or less. And he's all by himself, you know, and he's got his sad story about his, you know, family and past and everything. But yeah, so such a fascinating, and I could see why you would worry that he would seem tacked on, but like that just seems like there's got to be thousands of Deans out there doing
Yeah,
the same
and
thing.
it's very much flying in the face of the book because part of the book is the Teradyne Industries, which is a carryover from Fever House, have kind of aligned themselves with the U.S. government to rebuild the
Right.
world or the country, you know, and part of that is they're very reliant on um, a kind of labor force. Like all the people that are left are kind of expected to work for Pterodine, and in
Yep.
exchange you get like ration cards, to survive, and they have like Pterodine has like a spokesperson, this fictional woman named Jane, who's supposed to be like the face of America, and and you get your cigarettes and your windbreaker with Jane's face on it and all this stuff,
Right.
and his
Yeah,
notion of
Jane
like, I'm
branded
actually
stuff.
gonna
Yeah.
individually go out and interact with people and like salvage things from what was left over is
Yep.
very, I don't know, it's flying in the face of that kind of capitalist notion a little bit, you know um
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is like this idea that like, oh, there's stuff left over that we can still use, it's still valuable.
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. And now you mentioned Pterodine and that whole idea. It's kind of like one, it. This is so hard without spoiling stuff. Um, Imagine a situation where a corporation takes an opportunity when the world is falling apart to basically become like the thing, like to control every aspect of your life, kind of in a way.
Yeah.
Um, that's kind of what they chose to step in and do. So there's a level of control and an insidiousness to all of that as well, that you would expect from an evil corporation during an apocalypse.
Yeah, there you go.
um, but all right, so I do want to talk about the fevered. So one of the outcomes of the events of Fever House is that there's this global catastrophe where through a phone call, a good portion of the world's population are turned into kind of effectively a zombie-like kind of situation where they're um, feverishly violent and their biology doesn't work the way that human biology would work in normal ways. And so a good chunk of the whole world is kind of seized by this, in layman terms, like a zombie outbreak type situation. And so this is 5 years on from that event. And so one of the things that I noticed early, but continuously throughout reading The Devil by Name, is when you approach the timeline of things and you show these fevered people and the people who love them, how really you kind of leaned into how fucking heartbreaking
Mm.
these situations would be, like really just devastating, life rending situations from the very beginning. So I mentioned before, we start out in France, and Naomi is the character who we hadn't seen before, who we're following, who when we meet these characters, we kind of get their quick story of what happened to them when this call happened. Promise I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk. And so we get her brief story, and there's a thing about her dad wasn't with her when the call happened. He was at work or he was out of the house or whatever. And so like she doesn't have knowledge of what specifically exactly happened to her father and the way
Closure, yeah. She doesn't have
right.
definitive closure of, yeah.
So there's a moment where her mind is playing tricks on her. Possibly her mind's playing tricks on her. Maybe she thinks she sees her actual father. It's kind of vague in a Paul Tremblay way, whether that's the case or not. And so that's kind of one of the defining moments for me of like how the whole situation is viewed in the story as like the real human impact of what this does to people and what it means for them. Are they bags of meat? Are they, still
Yeah.
valuable lives? And so that's an approach to this type of situation I haven't really seen before. So was that always the intention to kind of like play with that?
Again, and I think that I can only write the way I can write, and like, so the book that I'm writing now, or that I just turned in today, is the book that's coming out after The Devil by Name, and it'll be out next year. and it's a vampire book. And I feel like I
Mhm.
did a really good job of just sucking any of the fun out of being a vampire and just kind of like laying the groundwork of how fucking brutal and depressing it would be, you know?
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's what I did with this, where it's like my job is to convince people that these people, to convince readers that these people are believable and real, you know?
Hmm.
And I don't think real people, for the most part, would be like, "Oh man, what a day! Oh my gosh, I wonder what I'll do next." As you know, the apocalypse has unfolded and all their loved ones have either died or gone missing. You know, and so
Right.
it's my job of convincing. That's my attempt at convincing people that, like, dude, the apocalypse would be a fucking drag and would be heartbreaking. You know, and we would all be
Yeah.
moored in just heartache. And so that's kind of what everybody is navigating. And I hope that if I couple that with enough narrative velocity, that it's a little fun to read, you know?
Hmm.
But yeah, it would be hard, dude.
Yeah, and there's an example I can think of is, and it's something that happens multiple times in different situations. Is imagine a situation where someone that you love becomes fevered and you're not. It's not the video game situation where you're like, oh, I have to kill them now, or even like
Yeah,
Shaun of the Dead where he shoots his mom. People keep them
right.
and find ways to keep them around, but keep themselves safe from them. And I feel like that's very genuine. I feel like that there's no way you could just decide, oh, it's not them anymore and toss them
No.
away. Like there would be such a visceral feeling of like, that's my person.
And constantly looking for hints that, like, oh, there he
Yeah.
is. There's the person that I loved. You
Yep.
know, trying to find little glints and glimmers of them. Like, I don't think you just shrug that off. So
Right.
it's like the whole, like, you know, tough guy of like, oh, I've got to shoot my wife because she's like, give me a fucking break. Like, you would not do
Right.
that.
Yep.
You'd probably die before you did that. You'd probably get bitten by her before you did that, because the heart doesn't work
100%.
that way, you know?
Right. Yeah. And so I appreciated that aspect of that approach to storytelling, but it gives you the opportunity to show some pretty heartbreaking situations or just really like mind bending situations.
Yeah.
There's when people tell me that they've read the book, all I say to them is, um, those two people in the car. Because there's one point where
Oh, right.
characters that we're following come across a car that's got two fevered people in it, and by all you know, by all measures, it looks like that car. They've just been in that car for years because they're
Yeah.
still seat belted in and there's dust and everything. And so, like, that's a fuck. Like, who thinks about that? But like,
Yeah.
that's a real thing that would happen. And so, like, I like how moored in reality you kind of decided to depict those little interactions and encounters. Is like that's really fucked up, but like that is absolutely something that would happen.
Yeah. And that's the joy of editing something 15 times. You know what I mean? It's like, once you get
Yeah.
once you get the skeleton down, then those like, oh, what would happen details start to come to light, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. Or like what would happen to a baby.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
good stuff.
Yay.
For and I could linger on that, but there are on the other side of the fevered conversation is that there's a lot of them, and one of the things that the government has started to do is kind of gather them in these places. Um, it's a combination of like a percentage just get eliminated and a percentage get gathered, and it's ostensibly for research or whatever. Like we're trying to find a solution to this problem. So there's these like big in urban areas and stuff. There's these big like maybe it's like a sports arena or whatever. They've just bolted all of these fevered people into this arena, and there's this one horrifying scene that you did where the gathering of all of these fevered into the same place is used as a way to kind of like an interrogation tactic in a
Yeah.
way that I
Oh
won't
man,
go too far
I
into.
like when I came up with that idea, I was like, this is the shit. Oh, I like it just scares the hell out of me thinking of it, you know?
Yeah, because
It
it's
was
like
so fun.
it's the putting someone, who's afraid of snakes in a room full of snakes or whatever. Like, it's that type of thing where there's nothing more horrifying than that situation, and like
We
people
can
are
totally
using
do the
that.
spoiler for this one, man. I'm down with that. But it's like, yeah,
So
so there are these containment centers, and they're like they've built a scaffolding, like a steel scaffolding, and then whoever they want to like dissuade from talking about rebelling, or a guy who just needs to get his act together or whatever, they're kind of put in like a body bag or a big leather duffel bag, and that it's hooked up with chains, and they're kind of just lowered down into this um, group of 1,000 fevered or so, and
yeah,
it's just this mad press of like zombies trying to get at you through this heavy bag, as
yeah,
there's like eyelets cut out inside so you can see what's happening. And like, yeah, it was just, I rarely am like, ooh, that freaks me out, but like that one
yeah.
totally did.
That and I think that the thing that I thought about that too is like, would it be better to know what's going to happen or not know what's going to happen?
Right.
And like, the character in this situation knew what they were getting into,
Yeah.
and I believe, and so they were pre-horrified by what was going
Yeah, and
on.
that's the thing, is
Um,
like that character John Bonner, who is a carryover from Fever House, is reasonably unflappable. He's
yeah,
a pretty tough dude, and it was nice to see him like pants shittingly terrified.
yeah, just like losing all control.
Yeah,
Yeah, which just emphasizes the effectiveness of that tactic.
yeah,
But that's kind of the other side of like they're a genuinely terrifying situation because they will tear you apart. They'll eat you. They're fever. They're
right.
not normal. And so I like that there was the side where you're looking at like the realistic interaction between the loved ones and their fevered, but also just like showing what an awful, terrible situation they create as well. So
Yeah,
kind of showed us both sides of it, which was
right.
cool.
Yeah, the
Um,
logistics are very complicated when 60% of the population is like that or whatever.
One of the things about that we haven't really talked about is the general conceit of why everything is happening, and it goes back to Matthew Coffin. And for people who had read Fever House, they'll understand. But basically, Matthew Coffin was presented with an opportunity, and in order to get something he wanted, he had to do this kind of deal with the devil, where he he disfigured himself. I don't know if I'm supposed to be shy about this, talking about this or not, but he does this kind of ritual that creates these remnants of himself, the hand and the eye and the stuff you see on these, if you're watching the video, the covers of the books behind me, and his voice, and ostensibly it's so that he can kind of get a redo on his life.
I mean,
um,
that's what he's told.
right. It's what he was, yeah, it's the promise he was, or
Right.
it's the goods he was sold or whatever, the bill of
Yeah.
goods. And so he does those things, and it causes all of this to be possible. um, and in this book, so the entity that he dealt with is now pushing their agenda forward by trying to you know take advantage of the remnants that were created and the people that are involved. They're trying to, there's an ultimate goal, and there's a thing that needs to happen. But the thing I liked about the setup with this kind of like supernatural entity was that it wasn't necessarily anything specific, at least in my kind of general knowledge.
You mean
And
like
so it
religiously, or
religiously, yeah,
yeah.
religiously or whatever. But for me, at least, it hinted that the thing that could cause the end of everything isn't even necessarily that high on the power list
It's kind
of
of off to the side.
supernatural.
You know what I
Right,
mean? Yeah.
right. Like, and it just kind of like, you know, got pretty successful with this,
Yeah.
this attempt at taking over the world or whatever. So um, I really enjoyed the fact that this isn't even necessarily the most terrifying thing that could have tried to take advantage of the world. But then, like, is it because the other things that are more terrifying aren't even interested in this world or whatever? But
Right.
you like kind of pulled the curtains open a little bit on something much bigger without feeling like you needed to go into all of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that was the stuff with Matthew Coffin and the way Fever House ended was the hardest part to thread that needle for Devil, because it
Yeah,
was such a lexicon of mythology that I had just kind of left myself to solve later. And
sure,
so I
sure.
really had to be careful with that, and it was really hard. And that whole like kind of vagueness is super
Mhm.
intentional, and also that idea of like, oh yeah, this is not like Satan or whatever,
Right.
it's something that's kind of like half forgotten and kind of off to the side, and is just like found a kind of workaround,
Yeah.
and all that is super intentional, and it was very hard to like to navigate that in a way that again is mildly convincing, and summarizes all of those, that like make sure that all those balls in the air from Fever House land and land the way they should, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he was a lot of fun to write. Like all that Matthew Coffin stuff in The Devil by Name is kind of
Yeah.
summarized by his journal entries, and
Hmm.
that are written in like the Fever House era or pre-Fever House era. So like back to when the world was normal and like pre-apocalyptic. And that was also super intentional because it was a way of kind of giving readers a break of
Yeah.
all of this like zombies and madness and stuff. And it's just this kind of like, failed rock star being a cock to his family, And so it was a nice like breath of fresh air,
Yeah.
until things started going inevitably horribly wrong for him. But
Hmm.
it was a way of kind of just giving people a break from the horrors of the apocalypse.
Which um, I think was definitely needed. That's one of the things that um, kind of dissuades me from wanting to engage with something that's like very overtly like apocalyptic, is that it's just unrelenting. And so
Yeah.
using Matthew Coffin's the diary or whatever you want to call it as a like a way to break it up, not only does it like do that, it gives us a break, but it also kind of in a way gave us it's not it took away, it took off the table the ability to just be like, well, fuck that evil guy, because
Hmm.
like now we have to be in his head and see why things happen, and it makes it much less easy to just be like, oh, that guy's evil and he's
Right.
caused evil because he wanted to be evil.
Yeah.
Now we have to confront the fact that like it was just a fucking guy who's trying to like, you know,
Yeah. Who has a lot of faults,
yeah,
but isn't this like mustache twirling, like, ha,
yeah,
you know?
not
Yeah.
like a Bond villain type
Yeah.
situation.
Totally.
It's like, like sometimes that's not how it is. And so
Yeah.
it was nice to give kind of retroactively give more context to the character of Matthew Coffin, who
And it had to be
always
done
famous.
too, because it couldn't
Yeah.
just have gone through like his wife Catherine's, through her
Right.
lens. Like he needed it,
Yeah.
And then it
Because,
also ties up like, given that the Fever House is so reliant on like auxiliary like stuff like interviews and news articles and government,
right.
things like government documents, like The Devil by Name needed that too, and so it needed this kind of like secondhand thing that's just not a straight narrative, so it
Yeah.
fit that way too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thematically or whatever you want to call it, for
Yeah.
sure. So I want to talk about in The Devil by Name, the character Naomi, who is special in the story, incredibly special as it turns out, but also refer back to from Fever House. There was a somewhat uh, possibly angelic character named Michael. And so starting out, I'm trying to think of, I've been thinking about it for a while, trying to figure out the right way to
Dude,
kind of like structure a
this
question.
just hearing it from like if somebody who hasn't read the books, just be like, what the fuck are they talking about? Like, there are
No,
so
that's
many
good.
like prongs of this plot and so many
Uh-huh.
characters, but like it's again super intentional about how everything intertwines. But
Yeah.
yeah, I pity the person who hasn't read these books yet. You know?
Who's listening to us talk about it? Yeah. So the evil being who puts all of this, who manipulates Matthew Coffin to put all this into, into play, has kind of an end game and things that need to happen for the end game. Um, Michael, the character from Fever House, who was also somehow supernatural and had kind of an idea of what the future looked like. That was kind of their thing. They would manipulate Michael to see future events.
Right.
Um, had a bad feeling about what was going to happen, um, and maybe tried to interfere. Is that too spoilery to say that?
I mean, we already did it, so what the
We
hell?
already did it, so it's on the books.
But yeah,
Um,
I mean, his job was ostensibly to be a kind of watcher of events,
right.
and he jumped the shark and decided to manipulate events instead.
Yeah.
And so
And
then
so,
he's kind of riddled for the first time with this notion of doubt, which is not usual for somebody like him.
mhm,
Like, oh, did I do the right thing? You know?
right. Oh, you said that so much better than I was trying to. But uh, because of that, um, it's not a foregone conclusion that the bad guy's plan is going to work.
Right.
And so there's this character Naomi who maybe kind of embodies some of the hope or the interference that maybe Michael did, and so much like Dean representing like kind of like the humanity and what did I say, adaptability, humanity, hope, all that stuff. Naomi represented like the light versus the darkness.
Yeah.
And without spoiling anything, I want to say that the way that you resolve things and how Naomi plays into the end of The Devil by Name, never saw it coming, and I thought it was just the coolest idea. And so bravo on sticking the landing with what Naomi
Thank
does
you.
and how she like impacts the the way that things turn out. I thought it was just chef's kiss. So
And
good.
ties into all of like, because Michael, who's a supernatural, with air quotes, angelic being,
Mm.
gets, he dies in Fever House. You know what I
Yep.
mean? But he has such, oh, I probably shouldn't have said that for people who haven't read the book yet, but whatever. Um, I figure everyone who's watching this at this point, Fever House has been out for over a year. So
Yeah.
like, um, but, uh, but he's so integral to it. But that was
Yeah.
also one of those kind of, you're juggling all these plot points and it's like, how do you summarize his involvement in it? And so, yeah, it's like, I think one of the things, and this is a total kind of side note, but I think one of the things that, as somebody who doesn't have a college degree or taking any like formal writing courses, I think that maybe what an MFA does for people is it gives them the kind of like language to talk about writing really well.
Sure.
And so, and I don't have that experience personally, like that's not my shtick. And so when I'm able to get kudos for like a plot and all
Hmm.
these like disparate points that are all brought together, it's just the biggest thrill because like, oh my god, there were so many what the hells at the end of Fever House that I had to like map
Yeah.
out. And so I really appreciate it when you're like, dude, you tied that up really well. That is like the
Yeah.
biggest compliment for me.
Well, and give yourself some credit because I mean they're huge books, and probably what 8 to 10 main characters in
Yeah,
each,
there's a lot. Yeah.
and drawing in so many different kind of things. It's not just like it's just zombies. It's like
Right.
there's a rock and roll. There's like possessed hands and government agencies and a fucking angel and like
Yeah, yeah.
we did this last time. Like there's so much stuff. So
Right.
to keep all of, like you said before, the balls in the air, but like to keep the momentum
Mm-hmm.
of that and to tie it up nicely, can't have been an easy task.
No, it
So
was like I was talking to my wife about it, and she's reading it now, and she's about to be done with it, and she's like, "Dude, this is maybe the best book you've done." Like, what? She's just remembering when I would be writing it, and just being like, "Oh, this is the shittiest thing I've ever done in my entire life,
uh,
and it's gonna suck," you know. So it's very
yeah.
cool to be like, "All right, it turned out pretty well," but it was hard at the time. It was so hard.
Um, it sounds like too you had some pretty big nudges from your editors and everything about
Yeah,
the
both
way
my
the story
editor
should.
and my
Yeah.
agent are fantastic, and my editor is just she navigates that whole like this just isn't working, buddy, but does it in
Yeah.
a way where she is able to like offer suggestions,
Hmm.
but also give me room to just be like, I'm sure you'll figure it out. You're on deadline. I'm sure you'll figure it out.
Very cool.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Um, yeah. I mean, I can't imagine. Well, I can't imagine writing a book, but I can't imagine writing a book without smart people saying, "I don't get this," or
Right.
this isn't tie up right." So yeah, it's got to be good to have the right support team to
Yeah, absolutely.
understand your vision and help you kind of like maximize it or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're getting to the point now where I've been like working with everybody long enough that it's like that like the trust is kind of inherent of like, okay, um
Yeah.
I get why you're confused by this. You know, I understand if I'm able to objectively like pull back, like I get what you're saying, you know.
Yeah.
And
That's
I think
great.
that's a service. Being a good writer is not getting defensive about shit like that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, and understanding that the intent is I want to help you get better. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Or be your best or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So tying it all together, I guess, um, for two books, a duology, a gigantic, and I really hope that there's some sort of omnibus kind of situation where there's like a special edition that's released later. If for no other reason than for you to get more paychecks out of it.
Yeah, there you go.
But because like they look so good together and the art is so great. But for two stories that are just goddamn insane with so many weird, dark, sad things going on, it's great how well you represented humanity and you really kind of threw some hope in there. I want to say the whole time. And so I think the most challenging thing about these books is trying to explain to people who haven't read them like the value of them in a succinct way because there's just so much, and I think
Yeah,
you should take that as a compliment because it's a hard feat to pull off. But um, uh, like if it's one of those situations where like now when I think about these books, I'm going to think more about what humanity would do in a fucked up situation. That's kind of like going to be my residual kind of like feeling about it, and I think that's a good way for me to land is having an impression of a couple of books.
yeah. Well, I appreciate that a lot. I think it's a lot better than various ways you could have taken it. You know, and I think I
Fair.
totally agree with you because like all of my stuff is so it just spans genres, you know, and I don't mean that
Mhm.
in a like hoity-toity way, but it's just you know I want to be I'd love to be a crime writer, you know. I'd
Yeah.
love to just write a crime novel, but I cannot put I can't do like a crime book without putting like a ghost robot in it or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or a you know a shoe that turns into a werewolf or some bullshit. Like I can't do it. So they are these kind of expansive genre crossing things, you know, and that's I think part of that is just that's what I find so entertaining, you know.
Yeah. Well, if this is going to be the outcome, I say fucking lean into that, man,
Yeah, absolutely.
because
Yeah,
like it seems
no
like you
no plans of
really,
stopping for sure.
yeah, you have um, the Keith Rosson voice that like no one is doing something like this, and I think that's a real asset. So
I
I'd
so
say keep
appreciate
going
that,
with
man.
it.
Thank you. Just made my day with that. Thanks.
I'm going to transition as because we're going to just have a few minutes left. So I'm going to transition it by just talking a little bit about crime. Um, because crime it came up in our conversation we had before. I listened to you talk to Neil McRobert and crime
Oh, there you
writing
go.
and stuff
Yeah.
came up. And part of the reason that my questions landed the way they did was because I already heard what you said to Neil, and so I was trying to fill in gaps, that
Nice.
like things
Yeah.
that weren't already talked about. But so crime writing, obviously, you are a fan of, and so what would you say are some of the crime writing that's influenced you, or that you would like to say maybe you see in your writing or whatever?
There
Like,
are people that I wish I could write like. Um,
yeah.
and that would be Todd Goldberg, Jordan Harper, and this Irish crime writer named Lisa McInerney, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah, those three people are just unstoppable.
Yeah. I think that, so I was talking to Craig Clevenger when his book Mother Howell came out, and I'm pretty sure he mentioned Todd Goldberg
Yeah.
as being, yeah, like a force
Yeah, and Jordan
in the
Harper
crime writing
just
community.
did Everybody Knows. I think the paperback
Yeah.
just came out.
Yep.
He is insanely good. Um,
Hmm.
and I talked about this on another podcast, but I just read a 20-year-old story collection called Controlled Burn by Scott Wolven.
Hmm.
Came out in like 2005, I think, and it's maybe the only book the dude has ever written or published, but it's the most chef's kiss, like insane collection of interconnected crime stories that I've ever read. Um, yeah, it's just, and so it's
That's
like
awesome.
reading a book that's like 20 years old and is like that built that perfectly for you specifically is just like, oh, it's amazing. It's like I just caught a bullet out of the air, like it's incredible.
That's and that emphasizes something that I've heard people saying more and more recently, which is that books don't have an expiration date. Like,
Yeah, and
you don't have to
I
read a
hold
book when
tight
it
to
first
that,
comes
man. I
out.
think books and music should be that way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, when I'm able to experience that of reading or listening to something that's been out for X amount of time and for whatever reason I just
Yeah.
missed it, it's such a gift.
I saw someone reading Perfume by Patrick Suskind, which came out in like the early 80s.
Oh, okay.
And that's like one of my favorite books. And so I'm like, it's obvious that this book is brand new. They just got it at the bookstore or whatever, and they're just digging into it now. And it's so cool to see this book that I read, 15 years ago and has existed for decades, is still gaining attention.
Yeah,
So yeah,
totally.
I love that kind of thing.
Right.
Um, well, Keith, I want to, we're going to wrap it up for, time reasons, but also because our technology is being so wonky with us today. So, sincere thanks for joining me again to talk about this book, and for creating such an awesome duology and making me think so deeply in a book about zombies, and all of that, and then leaving me with the lingering fucking question of what's going on with Nick Coffin. But anyway, I want to
Oh
say
man,
thank you.
I so my hope is, here's my hope. We get like something moving forward with TV or film and it's massively successful, and producers are pounding on everybody's door, and Random House is like, hey, what do you think about a third book, buddy?
Yeah.
And then we
Yep.
can answer that question.
Yeah. Yep. Because we love Nick Coffin, and
Yeah, totally.
I wish this series all the success in the world because it's fantastic and it deserves it. Selfishly, if I get to get more of it in one way or
Hmm.
another, I'll take that too.
Right on. I appreciate it.
um, but anyway, thanks so much for joining me, and I'm looking forward to reading about vampires. Is that next year?
Yeah, Coffin Moon, I think, is coming out probably fall of 2025.
Well, I'll bug you again to come back
Awesome.
and talk to me about that.
Can't wait.